Okay, so I picked out a great board of cherry for you guys yesterday. So I'm going to show you how to turn this raw board into something like this as a raw shell and ultimately into this finished drum. Here we go.
Okay, so I start off by cutting my staves to a 4-inch width from the raw board. I use a stop block attached to my miter saw so that I get a consistent width of the cut. So our ultimate width is going to be about 3.78 inches wide, so I have a little bit extra for us to play with once I start putting the bevels onto either side of the staves. So that extra little bit will help me out when I cut that off. The next step of the process is to add the bevels onto each side of the 4-inch staves. I've measured out the correct width for the finished staves and added a stop block onto my table saw sled in order to have consistent cuts on all the staves. Since this is going to be a 12-stave drum, in order to find the angle of each side we have to use some geometry. We know that there's 360 degrees in a circle, so if we divide that by the number of staves, which is 12, we get the angle that both sides of the stave will make, which in this case is 30 degrees. We're making cuts on both sides of the board, meaning we need to make 15-degree cuts on either side of the stave. So I've set my table saw blade to 15 degrees and double-checked with my angle finder. So once I cut one side, I flip the stave over and cut the other side so that they are opposing angles and will fit together appropriately when we glue them into the raw shell. And we do this with all of the 12 staves, so it takes a little bit of time. But always make sure you're safe when doing this. I use some clamps and push sticks so that I keep all of my fingers the same amount as when I started, and always wear your safety glasses and ear protection to keep your ears and eyes protected at all times. Okay, so I've got this shell dry fitted. I'm just checking to make sure all of my angles are correct and that it fits tightly together. And most of them look pretty good. Otherwise I'd have to sand them down a little bit to get a nice snug fit. Otherwise, if I have a wrong angle cut, I'll have to redo that stave, but they all look pretty good here. And then I clamp them together using these circle clamps that you'll find on your dryer hose. Okay, so once I've dry fitted all of my staves together, check the angles, make sure they're okay, getting ready for the glue up. So what I've done is put painter's tape along the back side of these staves that I've laid face down onto the table. Now this will help me once I flip them over and get the glue in between the joints to make sure that I can put this into the circle again and get them glued up nice and tight. Okay, now that I've flipped this over onto the back side, I'm going to go ahead and put in all the glue into each joint. Make sure I put a generous amount of glue in so that we have a nice tight hold. Once I get all the glue into each of the joints, I pull the staves together to form the shell using the blue painter's tape on the back of the staves. Once the ends are connected, I use the circle clamps again to tighten the staves against each other. I will then let the glue dry about 24 hours to make sure it is nice and cured. I have to do this in my basement this time of year since it gets pretty cold out in my garage and the glue won't set properly, and we don't want the drum falling apart. Okay, so now that I've removed the clamps and the tape from this drum and had it sit overnight, it's had about 24 hours to dry, I'm going to hook it up to my router table behind me here, and I'm going to trim off the outer edges of the drum to make it a circle on the outside. Okay, so I'm partway through milling this shell into the circular shape, and wanted to stop and take a look at this as the wood has revealed itself as I'm going through the milling process. So I lined up this board as I was cutting it, and I was expecting some more continuous wavy shape patterns, much like this already milled piece of cherry that I have here in stock, and you see kind of these wavy grain patterns on it. But what has actually been revealed in this, each stave has developed its own little circle, which I think is going to finish up really nicely and be a really unique addition to this piece that was just kind of unexpected, but I think it'll look really, really cool when it's done. Okay, so final test here to make sure that this is the right diameter around. I've got an extra 14-inch head here that I'm just going to place on here. Make sure it goes down all the way. And it does, and we're all set.
Okay, so now that we have the outside of the shell rounded, we're going to go ahead and round the inside. We're going to take this down to a shell depth, or a shell thickness rather, of just under ½ an inch, maybe about 0.45 of an inch, just under that ½ inch mark. So you got a nice thicker style shell to keep it more in round and be able to tune it a little bit better. Here we go.
Just a quick note about technique when rounding the inside of the shell. I started off going across the shell with my router to kind of take off some of the excess wood. But once I get a little bit of that excess down, I end up using the casters to turn the shell similar to rounding the outside.
So now we have the inside and the outside of the strum shell rounded, and it's starting to look a lot like what you would expect to see in a snare drum. The next steps involve sanding, applying a finish, and ultimately attaching the hardware, which we'll go into in part 2 of this cherry snare drum build series. So I hope to see you back for part 2. Until then, have a good day.